Hi, how you going? I was going to do one of those intros where I kind of go, oh, hi, how you going? And I almost did. My name's Geoff, and welcome to this live stream. Today we're talking about Japanese saws. There's been a bit of a theme lately, and I love Japanese saws, so that's why they've given me the job of talking about them. I could talk about them all day. We call them Japanese saws because they're traditionally used in Japan. The saws we get in Australia are made in Japan, but they are actually made or used in much more places in the world. So traditionally in China and Korea, places like that, East Asia. It's easier for us Westerners just to call them Japanese saws though. So the really distinctive thing about them, as you probably already know, is that they are pull saws. And what we mean by that is that they cut when the blade is going towards you as you pull it through the cut. Completely different to Western style saws where you cut when you're pushing. What that means is that the blade is being stretched. It's in tension in the cut. The wood is trying to pull the saw away from your hand, and your hand's trying to pull the saw away from the wood. So the metal between your hand and the cut is in tension. It's stretching out, which straightens the blade and makes it it won't buckle and bend. With a saw that's pushing through the cut, the metal between the cut and your hand is being compressed and will buckle and bend. And so you need to make a blade that's a lot thicker to resist that buckling movement. A thick blade is not as good as a thin blade for slicing stuff. If you ever tried to slice a pumpkin with a hammer, you'll know that it doesn't work. You need something very thin, and same with wood. So a thin blade leaves a thin curve. It takes less effort to make the same cut, and it's less wasteful. You don't get so much sawdust everywhere. I hope that makes sense. I hope that explains the kind of theory behind it. What I was going to do today is just demonstrate some of the different kinds that we stock here at Timbecon. Broadly speaking, there are two types of Japanese saws. There's the type that looks a bit strange to Western woodworkers, which has two cutting sides. Here's a nice big one. That's called a ryoba, and I think ryoba just means two-sided, double-sided. The cool thing about the ryoba is that it has a rip pattern tooth on one side and a cross-cut pattern tooth on the other side. So what you end up doing when you're using a ryoba oftentimes is that you end up cutting both cuts on a joint, so it's a tenon joint. You end up cutting both cuts with the same saw at the same time. When you've got a single-sided saw set up, you might do all your cross-cutting first and then go around and do all your rips later. So I find myself kind of flipping the saw like this when I'm using it. I'm constantly moving the wooden device and then just flipping the same saw over. There's some cunning kind of features to most ryobas that is good to know about. On the rip side, because you're starting the cut, I've got the wood sideways here, but because you're starting the cut at the near side of the blade, the teeth at the shoulder part, can you see that, are actually narrower and smaller. The TPI is higher here than it is down here, and that helps you when you're starting the cut, stops it from kind of jumping around so much, which it could do if the teeth were really big. So it's just one of those cunning little tricks. So that's ryobas. They come in like lots of sizes. They come in all the different sizes. So that's the big daddy, and here's the baby bear ryoba. It looks like there wouldn't be too much use for this size, but I end up using this all the time. Specifically, these little fellas here, they have these kind of tennis grip handles. They're designed for one-handed use, and I use these ones all the time. And then we have them also in a kind of medium size, which I don't actually have on me here. All right, so the other sort of, someone's pointing behind me. There's a medium-sized one there. Voila. So yeah, they come in that size as well. And these have the rattan handle, so like the cane style, more traditional kind of a thing. So the other kind is called kataba, which I think just means single-sided. I don't speak Japanese, but... And then there's two types of kataba. One is a Dazuki, and one is just what we call a kataba. So the standard kataba has just a short spine like that. Everyone see that? And so because the blade is unsupported, doesn't have a spine along it, the steel is a little bit thicker than a Dazuki. So that's kind of your general purpose saw. The advantage of using one of these over using a Ryoba is just when you're cutting through, so you're cutting all the way through the depth of the saw, with the Ryoba, the rip tooth, if you're cross-cutting, can actually leave a little bit of a scratch. Because there's a slight set to that, once these teeth start going through the cut behind the actual cutting side, they can leave a little bit of a scratch on the cut surface. Obviously, so a single-sided blade's not going to do that. And then you have a Dazuki. So these are the super fine ones. They have a full spine to support the blade. And that means that the blade is really, really, really thin. I think it's 0.3 of a millimeter, which is very fine steel. The TPI tends to be a lot higher, and this is for your fine kind of work. And again, all these saws come in different sizes. So you got the single size, you got the big daddies, and all that kind of stuff. So we also have this flush cutting saw. That is super thin. I don't know what that is, but it's super thin, and so it's super flexible. If you can see that, I can bend that right like this. And you would use that for trimming off whatever's projecting, so wedge tenons, dowels or whatever, and there's no set on one side of the blade, so the teeth are only set to one side, and it's the one with the engraving. So you would put the engraving facing up, and you would just curve it up like this and then cut. Extremely handy to have. Now all of these saws, apart from the flush cutting saw, have got disposable blades. So you can't really sharpen them because they're super hardened. If you tried to take a file to any of the steel, it would just sort of chip off and break. The teeth are so fine and tricky anyway, it's probably, you know, not worth your while to even try. So you just take the blade out, you chuck it away, put it in the recycling. You can use it for something else, turn it into a scraper or something if you like. And then you buy a new one. They come in these cool little packets here, very thin packet. Yeah, see that? And in different sizes to suit the saws. There is a little bit of choppy-changey exchangeability between the different saws and blades. So, for example, you can pretty much fit any Ryoba blade onto this handle. So if you really get fond of a handle, these new blue kind of grippy plasticky ones are pretty cool. You can put a smaller blade, if you like, onto that same fitting. Just to change the balance of the saw or suit whatever you're doing, different TPI and so on. Some of them you can't really do that, so these little single-handed ones, there's not a lot of flexibility around the blades that each handle will take, so there's a limited amount there. Right, so they're really easy to use. I'm going to demonstrate with these single-handed ones because I do lots of little stuff in my work, so these are the ones I'm more used to. The principle is the same for the big ones as well. But it's entirely backwards. If you're used to Western saws where you're on the push cut, you know, you get taught at school when you're doing woodwork that you kind of get over the cut, you mark out on the far side of the cut, and then you're pushing down. You've got to eyeball the far side of the timber, so you're really over the work. You know, you're using a sawhorse or whatever. With the Japanese saw, it's completely the opposite. You're marking out on the near side of the work, or I am. You're starting on the near side, on that near corner. And I usually just put my thumb there and just rest it against there just because, I don't know, that's my habit. And you're starting at the heel of the saw, obviously, because you're working back down into the cut. And because of the grind of these teeth, they're very kind of upright. So they do have a tendency to kind of skip and chatter a little bit when you're starting off if you're putting too much force on them. and I still am personally getting the hang of starting off without getting a chatter, but it's just a very gentle stroke. Let me try with one that I hadn't taken the blade out of. So it's just a very gentle stroke like that, and you'll feel a little bit of vibration, and then once you're going, you can start applying a bit more force. So the cross cut is the same. You start at the rip cut is the same. You start at the heel and you go down. What I find, pick that up so I don't step on it. What I find is that oftentimes, if I'm feeling flexible, and it's less and less likely now the older I get, but I actually get down like this. Can you see me if I get down? I actually get down on my haunches and use the weight of my kind of arm to pull the cut down on that near side. And I find that goes faster, and I can eyeball down the blade and keep it on the line as I go down. If I'm up here, I just sometimes find it a little bit hard, you know, because I'm a bit specky, have to wear glasses and stuff. So yeah, so with the rip cut, much the same. I'm going to try, I reckon, make sure that the blade's actually in the saw before I start. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to try and rip with this big, like pizza oven one, this big Ryoba. So I'm not going to worry about going too straight or anything. I'm going to start on the heel of the saw where the teeth are small, and I think I'm just going to start with a short stroke just to get that feel first, and then we're going to see how fast we can go. Yeah, so I can really feel that jumping around. What kind of timber is this, by the way? I'm not an Australian timber expert, but this is like, is it messmate or? Yeah, messmate. So it's reasonably hard stuff. Now, some people think Japanese saws don't work on hard timber because Japan traditionally doesn't have a lot of hardwoods. You know, they use a lot of cypress and that kind of stuff. I think, personally, I think that's a little bit confused. I use Japanese saws. I cut gidgee all the time. I cut all sorts of hardwoods with them. I've never had a problem. I will explain some of the errors that I've had in the past which might lead people to think that the hardwoods is the problem. It's usually user error, and those mistakes everyone makes, and I've made plenty of them myself. So this is reasonably hard stuff, that's my point. Now with a nice long handle like this, you can get a little bit funky with it. Or I don't know what the word is, but you can put a bit of weight behind it and use two hands. I'm not much of a cricketer, but you know, there's probably a bit of a cricket grip to be used here. Ooh. So that's pretty fast, and I wasn't using a lot of effort at all. And I've done, I don't know, 60 mil or something, and not very long. So yeah, you can probably see, I don't know if you can see where I've gone along earlier before, but there's quite a difference in the thickness of the kerf that you get with the different kinds of blades as well. So the Dazuki, which is the full spined version with the 0.3 millimeter plate, that gives you a very, very, very fine kerf. So perfect for me for making fret slots. You can either do, you know, put veneers or something like that into those slots. Right, but I did want to mention I made one of those mistakes that I always make, that I've historically made when I was just cutting there, and that is the good old, what I attribute to my my Western muscle memory, I would say, which is to put too much effort into the push stroke. If you do that, if you don't lift slightly as you're going back through the timber, because the kerf is so fine, because the blade is straightening inherently as it cuts through the timber, and that kerf is lovely and smooth and fine, there's not a lot of wiggle room. And if you push down when you're returning the blade back, the teeth will tend to grab, of course, and the blade will then buckle. There's nothing supporting it, and there's no space for it, there's nowhere for it to go. So it'll buckle, and you'll end up with a kinked blade. And once you've got a kinked blade, that blade is no longer usable for fine work. You can still use it for thrashing stuff out. You can still use it for docking old bits and pieces. But you're not going to be able to, cut dovetails with it. You're not going to be able to, do your fine work. So in that case, you need a fresh blade. The other thing that happens to people in a similar situation is that they're too rough with their blade, and they'll actually break a tooth off. The steel is hardened, and so it's fragile. The edges are hard, but the actual kind of bending resistance is quite low, so you'll break a tooth off. And then people will say, oh, well, these saws aren't any good for hardwood because look, I broke a tooth because I kinked the blade in the cut or whatever. That is, unfortunately, it is user error. It's not the steel itself. At some point, I want to have a competition. I want to get some ironbark or something like that, and I'm going to race Jake, who you might know from other videos. He's a big guy. He's got like biceps like an elephant's leg, and I'm going to get him on a Western style saw, and I'm going to get myself on one of these, and I'm going to give him a week to practice, and I'll give myself a week to practice, and then we're going to race, see how fast we can get through. And I reckon we'll get through it about the same. I don't think there'll be a major difference. I'd probably put money on myself, but I don't think that's legal with a Japanese saw. They are a lot faster because they're much finer. That's how confident I am. And if you're looking to jump into using Japanese saws for the first time, I recommend getting a set so that you can play around with the different variations and see how they apply to your work. Not everyone's going to use every saw all the time. I personally don't really use a spineless kataba. It's just not in my routine. But some people use it all the time. So it depends on your work. Anyway, that about wraps us up, I think.
No, we've got a question.
Oh, we've got a question.
Well, actually, what you can talk about.
Yep.
Is in the context of a blade that's been damaged.
Yes.
How you own a brand new one, you grade the saws.
You do. Yeah.
So you might actually own 3. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, what I do is I actually hang on to the envelopes because I kind of like the look of them anyway. So when I finally thrashed a blade out, even if it's just getting dull and I haven't actually damaged it, but it's just been around for a while, I will hang on to it and I'll swap it in and out of a handle depending on the work that I'm doing. So you might actually have sort of 3 blades for a given handle. You have your really good one that you take care of, you polish it, you put it on your pillow when you go to sleep and give it a name and all that kind of stuff. And then you have your kind of medium one, which is your sort of like all-rounder, kind of like, you take her out to the movies, but you don't think that it's going to last very long. And then, sorry, that's a terrible metaphor. And then you've got your absolute thrasher. And that metaphor is not going to work in that case. Which is your sort of like, oh gee, I just need to like break down this bit of whatever it is, or you take it to the timber yard, and you kind of like, threaten people with it or whatever. So you tend to have I tend to, and I think lots of people do, tend to have a sort of a grading system of their blades. They keep the old ones around for that reason. If you're super finicky and you're only ever doing really, really fine dovetail-y stuff like that, by all means you can throw the old ones away because you probably never use them again, but most of us probably would keep them around. Any more information about Japanese saws, you can find it on our website, or you can always give us a call. We're happy to chat anytime.